guess we might as well get started. I imagine there'll be one or two folks trickle in, but we'll go ahead and get the evening going. Appreciate you everybody being here. This issue that we're about to talk about, this constitutional amendment, is probably the most significant thing that we're going to have to deal with in the primary election. We got all kinds of people to choose from, but this amendment is likely to affect whichever way it goes, is likely to affect us for generations. So it's something that needs to be taken very seriously and needs to be, as you know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but any decision made on it is very, should be done with a lot of research and a lot of wisdom. Tonight, I have a gentleman here, native of Kansas, native of Onega, and he was an Onega alumni, went on to be a clerking for was it a Supreme Court Justice? Supreme Court Justice Clark?
Retired.
Right. Yeah, and then went on and was eventually selected to be a Kansas district judge, and retired from that, and has taken this issue as one of the important things that we wanted to talk to everybody about. And so I want to introduce you to Judge Tom Martin. And
that's M-A-R-T-E-N, as all of you who live in this area know, is the correct way to spell Martin.
And I'll leave it to you.
Found out Don and I are actually distant relatives. My paternal grandmother was a Honig, and there are a number of them in the Onega areas, I'm sure. A lot of you know. My mother was from Wamego, my dad from Onega, and I still have various relatives, shirt-tail relatives spread around Onega. My brother Fred was school superintendent at Onega for a number of years and retired, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years ago. But it's always wonderful to get back up to this part of the state. For me, I spent a lot of years away from it. As Don indicated, after law school, we moved back to Washington, D.C., and I spent a year clerking at the U.S. Supreme Court for a retired justice, Tom Clark, who was a member of the Warren Court. He retired, believe it or not, at the age of 67, which is almost unheard of for a Supreme Court justice, but he did it because Lyndon Johnson wanted to appoint his son Ramsey as Attorney General of the United States. And so I spent my year clerking with him. He died at the end of the year, of my year of clerking, and so it was a sad end, but it was fascinating to go through a number of his papers, and Ramsey and I largely planned his memorial service. I then went to work for a multi-city law firm, first in Omaha, Nebraska, then in Minneapolis, Minnesota, before my wife and I and our 2.5 kids moved to McPherson, Kansas, where I practiced law for about 15 years. And then being the darkest of dark horses, President Clinton appointed me to the U.S. District Court for the District of Kansas, and I served there for 25 years. Retired back in 2021, taught for a year at Washburn University Law School as a visiting lecturer for 1 year, and it turned out to be too much like work and not enough like retirement. And so since that time, it's been mostly a matter of surgeries and recuperation. At that stage of life, I think a lot of people understand what that's about. I would like to introduce you to Becky Anderson, who's seated at the end of the second row over here to my left and your right. And Becky she's from Lindsborg, spent virtually all of her life there, except for the time that her dad was in the service back in New York, and they lived in New York City for a while, a couple of years, Becky. And then she started dating a fellow when she was in high school, Carl B. Anderson Jr., who grew up in Lindsborg as well. Went to Bethany, great tennis player, wonderful person. He went to law school. They spent some years in Sublette, where he practiced, and then they moved back to Lindsborg. And her husband, B, his middle name literally was the letter B, no period after it. And he was talked into running for state district judge in the 9th Judicial District. And he won and was on the bench for 30, how many years, Becky? 33? And B, sadly, was afflicted with diabetes from the time he was about 2, and just fought a monumental battle against it with Becky at his side all the way, and he died about 13 years ago. Best trial judge I ever appeared of. I was in court almost every day of my practice career in McPherson. And if I modeled the way I judged or handled matters in the courtroom after anybody, it was after B. Anderson. And just an extraordinary person, and he had an extraordinary wife all those years who was with him to the end. And I've been very fortunate to have Becky as part of my life for about the last year now. And she did not want to miss this. Coming from Lindsborg, as you might, and by the way, I have to ask, how many of you here kind of tend toward the Democratic Party as your party of choice? How many of you tend toward the Republican Party as your, and that's good? And how many of you are totally independent of either party and just, I grew up a Democrat, and I was raised a Democrat. I'm sure that'll shock nobody given the fact that I was a Clinton appointee to the bench. But you know, in all the years that I've been voting now, I've never voted a straight Democratic ticket in my life. Not one time. I have always split my votes and have made it an effort to try and get acquainted with the people who are running for office. And so I have voted for governors, Republicans, that I thought were superior to our Democratic candidates. And I can't make the same claim about the presidential elections, except that as I was going through the process of all of the hoops you have to jump through to get to the federal court, Bob Dole and Nancy Kassebaum could have not treated me kinder or with more respect than they did. And I have never told any single person who I voted for president in 1996 because I felt I owed Bob Dole just as much as I owed Bill Clinton in terms of that appointment. But boy, how things have changed over the years, and I'd give anything if we could return to that era of mutual respect and helping each other accomplish things for the country rather than individuals. Well, we're here to talk about tonight this amendment to the Constitution of the state of Kansas. How many of you have some familiarity with it? Just about everybody is. Well, the point of the amendment is to return to, and I say return because I'll go through the history in a minute, to return to the direct election of justices to the Kansas Supreme Court. Right now, we follow what is generally called the Missouri Plan. And that is, and this used to be true for Court of Appeals judges as well, but they changed the law on that a few years ago. But we have what's called a Supreme Court Nominating Commission. And that comprises 4 lawyers, one from each of the 4 Kansas congressional districts. And they are selected by the lawyers in that district, only the lawyers in that district. Then there are also 4 non-lawyers on the commission, one from each of the congressional districts. And those are selected by the people in the district. And so you've got an equal number of lawyers and non-lawyers on the commission, and then there is a 9th, and that is a lawyer who is elected statewide by the lawyers. Not the Kansas bar, but every lawyer everywhere who is admitted to practice and in good standing in the state of Kansas can vote. And the current chairman is a fellow named Terry Campbell from Lawrence. I have known Terry for about 40 years and is as fine a guy as you could ever hope to meet. So that's the commission. Anybody who wants to be considered for a position on the Kansas Supreme Court when there's a vacancy has to file an application with the commission, and then the commission goes to work. Now, having been through an FBI investigation myself, a White House investigation, an American Bar Association investigation, these are the equivalent of all of those things. So anybody who puts in is going to be assigned to one of the members of the commission who is responsible for gathering information on it. And any member of the commission can gather information on anybody who has applied for a position. But one person is primarily responsible for that person. And they contact not only the references, because everybody's references, like for any other job, you're going to put down people who are going to say the good things about you. And you're probably going to avoid putting down the folks, if there are any out there, who would not say good things about you. But they go beyond that. They go knock on doors in neighborhoods. They call neighbors. They talk to them to get as full a picture of the person who has applied for the position as they possibly can. And so this is not some Skippy DePunk kind of, glossed over, yeah, I talked to a couple of people and they say this is an okay person. It is an in-depth investigation. And that information is brought back to the commission. And then each of the candidates, each of the persons who's put in for a position, has an interview with the entire commission sitting as a whole. Those are open to the public. So anybody who is interested in hearing what any nominee or all of them have to say during their interviews with the commission can attend those meetings. But if you can't attend in person, you can also attend via streaming. So you can watch it in real time via streaming, and they also record the interviews. So anybody who is interested can go back and get online and pull up the interview of any of those persons and watch as much or as little of it as you choose to. And the whole point of this being that it's not a once-over kind of thing. It is a really serious look at the people who have put in for the position and the information that's been turned up. Carol Byer, who is a retired Kansas Supreme Court justice, and I knew her back when she was practicing law with the Folston firm in Wichita, said that the first question that she was asked in her interview when she was being interviewed by the commission is, what's not in any of the materials you've submitted or things you believe that we've learned that you think we ought to know about you? So they had an opportunity, and these interviews go for as long as people, as long as the commission wants to interview them. And then the commission votes, and they end up sending 3 names to the governor. And the governor chooses the appointee from the 3 names that the commission sends to her, in our case now. That then is the selection process. Now, whoever is appointed to that position, and the vacancy that exists on the court right now, our Chief Justice Marla Lukert, who is a wonderful person and who I've known for years and years as well, had a stroke and is incapacitated, and so she had to step down. So that's the vacancy that will be filled now. Prior to this, it was Justice Evelyn Wilson, who sadly contracted ALS and I think probably lived for 1.5 years, maybe 2 years after she discovered to have it. And her spot was taken through this process by a woman named Larkin Walsh. Now, the Walsh name means a lot to those of us who are from Onega, Kansas, because Doc Walsh was one of our town doctors forever, and then his son Tom came back and practiced medicine in Onega forever, and his son Matt married Larkin. And so, you know, there's kind of that neat little Onega tie for us with Larkin. And she had clerked, and I think that Justice Carol Byer would probably tell you, was one of the best, if not the best, law clerk she ever had. And she was thrilled to death when Larkin was appointed to the bench, and in fact, Justice Byer was one of the speakers. But that's the process now. How long's that process been in place? Since 1958. Now, when the Kansas Constitution was first adopted at the Wyandotte Convention, it provided for the direct election of Supreme Court justices by the citizens of the state. And how many of you are familiar with what's called the triple play that changed all of that? Okay, at least a couple of you are. Back in 1956, Fred Hall was governor of the state of Kansas. And you guys can tune out on this if you want to now while the rest of us talk about it. But he was governor of the state of Kansas, and he was defeated in the Republican primary. And he was very unhappy about that. There was a justice on the Kansas Supreme Court named William Smith, who was not in very good health. And he was not crazy about the idea of a Democratic governor potentially appointing his replacement. And 11 days before Governor Hall's term expired, he resigned as governor. And so the lieutenant governor became the governor of the state. Justice Smith resigned from the bench, and the lieutenant governor who became the governor then appointed Fred Hall to the Kansas Supreme Court. And this outraged the people of the state of Kansas because it looked like they were doing an end run around what was originally intended. And they adopted overwhelmingly a constitutional amendment that changed the way we pick Supreme Court justices in Kansas to what our present system is. Now, you're going to see a lot of ads. I think you're seeing more vote no ads now against the current amendment. But there are a few that are vote yes and talking about giving back to the people the power to elect the people who are on the Supreme Court. It all sounds pretty nice and kind of like something that maybe ought to be. The problem with it is that the states that have gone to the direct election model, and Wisconsin is one of the more recent examples, went to a direct election and out-of-state money poured into the tune of, in the last Supreme Court race, $100 million was spent on one race for a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice position. Now, a lot of that was out-of-state money. And there are a lot of negatives that I'm happy to talk about or to answer questions about, or at least to talk about with you all tonight about why this is a bad idea. But there are two basic reasons that the Republican legislature passed this bill that would modify the Constitution. Anybody know what they are? They were two Kansas Supreme Court decisions. Yes. School funding was one of the big ones. One of the big ones, yes. And abortion. Those are the two issues that the legislature is trying to find a way around. They couldn't do it by in lawsuits. They lost those. They hate the idea that there are people who are sitting in judgment looking at all the facts who are telling them what needs to be spent in order to provide an adequate public education, which our Constitution requires at this point, and the Supreme Court finding that our state Constitution, unlike the federal Constitution, gives women the right to choose with respect to abortion, and that the legislature can't put restrictions on that. And so they think that the way to get around this is to change the way we select justices to the Kansas Supreme Court with the hope that they can elect people and put them on the court who will modify the earlier decisions of the court with respect to school funding and abortion. And when you cut everything else away, that's the whole purpose for this. It was Chris Kobach who suggested that an amendment to the Constitution might be just the thing that they needed. How many of you remember, well, I'm sure every one of you remembers well, the vote on abortion and the change to the Constitution a few years ago? Do you remember what the margin of victory was in that case? It was like 60-40. It was overwhelming. And I think it stunned the nation. And I remember telling some friends that just goes to show that women are smarter than men, and you get a bunch of women together, they're going to make things happen. Unlike the way men do. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but I don't think it's too much of one. I mean, women seem to have had the ability to get together, organize, and do extraordinary things when they put their minds to it. So that's why we're even at this point where we're voting on this. And the ramifications of it are, as Don said, far-reaching. And whatever happens here, and I am hopeful that the proposed amendment goes down, and not only goes down, but goes down in a big way. So maybe the legislature will spend some time dealing with issues that it really ought to deal with, and not messing around in people's lives to the point where they don't need to be. So anyway, that is the long and the short of how we got where we are. Now, if this amendment would pass, there's nothing in the amendment that deals in any way of what the procedure would be, how any of this would be handled. I mean, it's just the people will elect the justices, and everything else is out there wide open. And nobody knows what power the state will have, the legislature, what the judicial districts may be able to do or not be able to do. How many of you remember 1977 when they overhauled the structure of the state court system? I had just graduated from law school in '76, and in '77, they gave each of the judicial districts the right to decide whether to elect their district judges or whether to go with the Missouri plan, which is essentially what we have here. And there is a map in one of these brochures that shows what districts went in what direction. But I practiced in Wichita, or in that area, or was on the bench there for 25 years. And in Sedgwick County, they elect their judges, their district judges. And it's interesting because nobody researches who the judges are. They just don't. I mean, most people, first of all, don't have the time. And second, most of them don't have the interest in checking out each one of these candidates for these judicial positions. And so what you see every year with the ones who are running is all of the Republican candidates get within a few percentage points of each other in the votes, and each of the Democrats get much lower vote totals, but all within a few percentage points of each other, which tells you that people are voting by party and what they assume the party is going to do if they're in judgeships, and not in terms of the credentials that people have. And so what has happened over the years is a bunch of Democrats have become Republicans just so they have an opportunity to get into a race for a judgeship. And, you know, there are some great Republican judges. They've been Republicans since birth, and I would never say that there weren't. There are some Democrats that have no more business being on the bench than, well, Mickey Mouse, maybe. But the fact is, there are good people in both parties, but people don't have the time or the inclination to do that research. And that's one of the things that the commission does with the Kansas Supreme Court judges. In my old district, the 9th Judicial District, where Becky's husband was a judge, that district voted to go with the Missouri plan. And so, although B had to run for judgeship, I think the first, maybe the second time too, just one time. And then they changed over to the Missouri plan, so he had to stand for retention, which is another aspect of all of this. And he was always overwhelmingly retained. But people knew who he was by that time. You know, there was a big push several years ago, right after the abortion decision, to against retaining several of the Supreme Court justices. And they could not, because of their code of ethics, they couldn't go out and raise money for that. Now, in Wichita, the judges can go out and raise money. And so who do they go to first? They go to the lawyers. So the lawyers are ticked off, you know, about being asked for contributions. But then they feel like, to some extent, maybe the judges ought to remember who contributed to their campaign funds when they have cases in front of them, which is just ridiculous. And I'm going to back up for just a minute. I spent 25 years as a federal district judge in Wichita. I saw every kind of federal case imaginable there. And I was appointed for life. That's one of the things about being an Article III judge under the Constitution. You're appointed for life. So you don't have to worry about elections. You don't have to worry about having to go out and raise money. I remember after some decision I made, a woman sent me an email and said, well, I'm sure not going to vote for you in the next election. And, yeah, I think that is, excuse me, largely where too many of the folks are. In terms of they just don't understand the process. And one thing lawyers do understand is the process. The good people who are on the Supreme Court nominating commission are wonderful. But the judges, and there were several of them, who were really targeted after the abortion decision and the subject of we want to not reappoint or we do not want to recall. For example, Justice Lee Johnson from Caldwell, Kansas, great guy, wonderful person, was one of the targets. Carol Byer was a target. I think Marla Luker was a target at that point. As somebody who spent some time deciding cases, one thing I can tell you is every week I made decisions I didn't like. Ones where I thought, you know, the equities are actually, but the law said this. And our oath is to uphold the law. We make decisions based on the law, not on what we think is fair or who we like better. Fortunately, most of the times fairness in the law squared up. But frequently, they did not. And my own position, which I could not talk about when I was on the bench, but now that I'm retired completely, I can. I was always pro-choice, but we had a case, a doctor. When you all probably remember when Dr. George Tiller was killed in church. in Wichita. Gunman walked into the church where he was ushering and shot him dead. And the guy's serving a life sentence now. Some people thought he was a hero. I did not have that case. But he was anything but. And we found out things about George Tiller afterwards that I wish we had known before, that he was a flight surgeon, that the thousands of hours he gave away giving treatment to people who needed it before he would perform an abortion. He had heart-to-heart visits saying, you understand what this means, and are you absolutely sure this is what you want to do? And he turned out to be a much nicer and finer guy than the way he was portrayed in the press by the anti-abortion folks. Well, there was a woman who went to visit this assassin in prison, and she was very much on his side of the abortion issue. And she wrote a letter to this doctor who was going to set up an abortion clinic in Wichita, and said, you need to stop and think about what you're doing here. You know, do you want to have to be checking under your car for bombs every day to see if somebody has planted one there? Do you want to have all this security around y'all? Do you really want to live like that? And she ended up being charged by the U.S. attorney with threatening this doctor. And I didn't see it that way, and I tossed the case. I thought if it was her mother that was writing her this letter, as opposed to this woman, you know, who she didn't know writing it to her, that it would be seen as, you know, an effort to assist rather than, and she never said, I'm going to do this, or somebody's going to do this, or anything like that. Well, the circuit reversed me, and it came back, and we ended up having a trial. And the jury acquitted her after a trial. And so although I did not like the letter she wrote, she does have a First Amendment right to express her views, and there was not an overt threat there in her letter. And I dealt with cases like that all the time, where the decisions were difficult, and you thought, God, I'd sure love to be able to go this way, but this is what the law says, and this is what I have. And that's where the Supreme Court is. It's also, I think, very different being one of 7, like the Kansas Supreme Court, and sitting alone at the bench yourself and making decisions yourself. And when appeals went from my court, they go to a 3-judge federal appeals court, the Court of Appeals. And then just a precious few cases get up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And actually, I kind of lost interest in what happened in my cases after I was through with them, because there were always 12 more waiting there to be decided. But anyway, I can tell you that as a judge, it was really wonderful to have that independence and to not feel like you owed anything to anybody. Nobody could come to your door and knock on it and say, remember, I contributed X dollars to your... And even if a judge would not do anything with that information, it just, we're supposed to avoid as lawyers even the appearance of impropriety. And some things just don't look good, and some things don't smell right, even if they are. And that erodes, I think, the faith of the public in the courts and the court system. So that's kind of my take on where we are, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or comments or take any questions you might have.
Well, in this atmosphere that right now, basically at the federal level of questioning really the Justice Department and decisions that they make, that's one of the reasons I'm very leery of changing the court system here in Kansas, is because, you know, that is the one segment of our government that should be neutral and should be above suspicion.
Yeah.
That's why I'd like to keep it the way it is.
Well, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Kansas is the arm of the Department of Justice out here. And I just had terrific prosecutors in my court all the time. I never questioned motives behind what they were doing beyond attempting to enforce the law. It's an interesting thing because I was probably the most appealed judge on sentencings in the District of Kansas by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And sometimes I was reversed, sometimes I wasn't. There's a kind of an interesting case. I don't want to digress too much, but I departed downward about 9 months. The guy from about an almost 8-year sentence to a 7-year sentence. And the government appealed. And I had said this guy had a good record, you know, long time he was out, he acknowledged what he'd done, you know, I gave all what I thought were the good reasons. And the circuit reversed and told me I had to give him a guideline sentence, and the guideline in the case was like 8 years or whatever. So he came back and I had to follow what the circuit tells me to do, so I gave him a guideline sentence. And in the meantime, the Supreme Court decided another case that said judges have discretion in those cases, so it went back to the circuit. And they said, well, now the Supreme Court has said that you've got discretion, and the fact that you would not have given a guideline sentence to him is the fact that you didn't in the first place. So they sent the case back to me again. And so I did a third sentencing with him. But the Department of Justice is, it really saddens me and it sickens me to see what has happened, because obviously they are out there attempting to get retribution for perceived slights that yeah.
I think I know what the answer is on this, but when you talk about the commission being made up of lawyers, non-lawyers, from the
Yeah.
districts, and they all sit right like the lawyer is a lawyer as a chairman of this board. The applicants, does anybody know what party anybody's from on the board or and applicants? Because it shouldn't make any
No.
difference at all.
And the answer is
just
no.
want a nonpartisan, want them to just rule on the law.
I think if you ask any member of the court now, or if you ask any person who's been interviewed by the commission, they would say that the subject of political party or politics never came up.
And I was just curious because they nominate 3 and send it to the governor, and the governor chooses one of those 3. And so, I guess I've never investigated the whole system in the past until this is being brought up, and so it just seemed to me that it shouldn't be partisan, so I don't understand really, what the problem is.
No, politics simply does not enter into the mix. It's a question of whether you're qualified or not, they'll ask you how you would handle certain kinds of cases. And I remember when I had my Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, and Senator Cole from Wisconsin asked me about how I would handle a case. And I took him through procedurally what I would do, but did not say, and this is where I'd come out on the case. Said, you know, first I'd take a look at what the statute is, then I'd look at relevant case law, precedent. I'd certainly want to look at what the facts were to make certain that those were all there, but and I'd make a decision based on those. And you know, frequently too, when you hear arguments, and this was a little frustrating as a judge, most judges don't hear oral argument in cases anymore. I always liked, I thought it was a chance for a lawyer to get up and be a champion for their client and, you know, bang on the table a little if they needed to. But, you know, some would ask for oral argument, and then they'd get to court and they say, well, we think we said it all in our brief, so unless the court has any questions. Well, you know, that's just, what's the point? You know, I can decide on the briefs, that's perfectly all right, but I want them to have a chance to shine for a client. And I always thought that for a judge to call a lawyer down in court in front of a client was not a good thing. All it does is destroy the faith of the client in their lawyer and in the system. And I always thought we ought to be as courteous and kind as we could. And in criminal sentencings, I always felt my job's not to punish. My job is to give the person who's in front of me the best chance at making a life once they get on the other side of whatever the sentence is. And, you know, I knew guys who said, boy, I just love to throw the book at them. And I said, I've never gotten any joy out of that. And as a matter of fact, I said, I've never lost a moment's sleep from giving somebody too short a sentence, but I've lost a lot of sleep over giving people what I thought were too long a sentence or too harsh a sentence. So, judging's a whole different world, but grateful to have had the chance. Yeah.
Should this amendment pass, is there anything in there that requires qualifications for an individual who wants to run for the Supreme Court?
No. No. Whatever's in the Constitution now, you know, you don't even need to be a lawyer to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't need to have a law degree. Anybody can do it, but it's just, I think, been pretty much taken as...
But that's a vetted process too.
Yeah, that's very much. I mean, as I told you, when I was going through, and I think there were 17 people who started out hoping to get the position that I got, and I ended up going through, well, there were actually two different tracks. And one was directly to the president, who I didn't know, had never met. And the other was through a setup that they made here in Kansas where a lot of the political people, and I mean, Kathleen Sebelius was insurance commissioner at the time, Jim Slattery was in Congress and gonna run for governor, and Sally Thompson was state treasurer, Joan Finney had been governor, John Carlin had been governor, Dennis Langley was the state Democratic chair at the time, and I had individual interviews with each of those folks. And the only one I couldn't get one with was Dan Glickman, and who I had never met. And it turns out that that was because there were a lot of people who wanted this position and who thought they were entitled to it. And he was the one who was going to have to tell all of them who didn't get it that they didn't get it. And he was able to say, I never gave Martin the time of day, so I had nothing to do with his appointment. And that all was accurate. I always admired him, thought he was a great guy, and until I couldn't get a hold of him. Still think he was a great congressman and great Secretary of Agriculture, and I understand the hardest job he ever had was president of the Motion Picture Association, and trying to decide who got tickets to the Oscars and who didn't. Any other questions? Concerns? There are, I saw back there, I meant to bring, I have a vote no sign that I got somewhere a few weeks ago, and I discovered that I live in a duplex north of Topeka, about 5 miles, and my homeowners association does not allow yard signs. So I was going to bring it and give it away as a door prize tonight. That was Becky's suggestion, but anyway, whichever way you go, I do hope you'll go out and vote. This really is a critical issue. And I'm very proud of the fact that so many people in the Kansas Women Attorneys Association has been particularly active, and the Appleseed Foundation here in Kansas has been very, very active in turning out the vote. And I think they're hoping for the same kind of outcome for this. And I'm one of them. I belong to the Kansas Women Attorneys Association. I'm not transitioning, but I do belong to the organization because I think it's a great organization. And they're working very hard to try and ensure that this doesn't happen. Yes?
I wanted to ask you if there were any other federal judges from Kansas that were appointed by Clinton also?
Yes.
Are there?
Yes, there was one. His
Not
name,
just you.
I was the first of two. Fellow who was appointed a few years after me was Carlos Murguia from Kansas City. And Carlos resigned from the bench several years ago. I just don't think it was a good fit for him, and can't tell you what he's doing now. But there were 3 George Herbert Walker Bush appointees to the bench. There have been, well, there were 3 vacancies, and 3 people just got confirmed who were Trump appointees, and there were a couple of other Trump appointees before that. So he's had a significant impact on people who are on the federal bench. My great uncle was from Pottawatomie County, from Wamego. His name was Delmas Hill. And Delmas Hill was appointed by Harry Truman to the federal district court. And so I remember as a little kid going to the courthouse in Kansas City with him. And that's back when they used to be in post offices, and seeing the wanted posters, you know, and it kind of smelled like the ink that the old post offices had. And then John Kennedy appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. And I got to sit with the 10th Circuit a couple of times during the time I was on the bench. And I'll take the district bench anyway, as opposed to an appellate bench. You get to make your own decisions. You don't have to convince anybody else about how right you are and how wrong they are. And I had a sign that I used to keep in my office. It said I'd agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. Yes?
There's advertisements on TV and social media urging you to vote yes. Has anybody looked into who's financing those advertisements?
I don't know if they have or not. I would imagine that there is some fairly significant money coming in from out of state for those. The Kochs may very well be funding some of that because they're frequently, they not only fund some very, very worthwhile things, but they've also funded some things that are certainly in their business interests.
If I remember right, I thought I read something about Americans for Prosperity.
That's very
I
possible.
think I saw that on the ads.
I think that's the Coke funded organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Well, I sure appreciate all of you coming out on a hot afternoon, early evening. And Don, thank you very much. It's always good to meet a Honey relative from up in these parts.
We were hoping to fill the room. I
Well-
apologize, we didn't get more warm bodies in here, but.
I'll tell you what, the ones we got are the ones I wanted to talk to. So I'm very grateful for that.
If anybody wants to take a vote no yard sign, I have 5 of them back there with the holders and everything. There's also bumper stickers back there, a stack of them, so if you want to embellish your car with an opinion, for sure grab as many of them as you want.
As Democrats, you might appreciate this, at least all but a couple of you. But I think you'll appreciate this too. My predecessor on the bench was a fellow named Patrick F. Kelly. And Judge Kelly was just an extraordinary fellow. And he ran for Congress against Garner Shriver some years back, before he was appointed to the bench by Carter. And he was supposed to debate Garner Shriver at the state fair. And one of Humphrey's, Hubert Humphrey's advance men came in. This must have been 68. This woman, and this is in Hutchinson, of course, State Fairground, pulls in this great big black Cadillac. And this little old lady gets out of the car and goes tripping off to somewhere. It was an important parking spot. It was a reserve thing. And Humphrey's guy said, well, who is that? And Pat said, oh, it's such and such. And she was a higher up in the Republican Party. And the guy said, stay here for just a second and hold on to my case. And he reached into his case and got something. He went over and put a bumper sticker on her car that said, F-bomb communism. And she apparently drove around for several days before she realized she had this bumper sticker. So even Hubert Humphrey, you know, the happy warrior. Well, again, thank you all so much. And if there's anything you want to talk about, I'll be happy to stick around for a few minutes. So.